I will also walk around a little bit, so if in the back you cannot hear me, just let me know and I will stick to the microphone, because a couple of days ago, actually, I was in a theater nearby here in the countryside, and it was one of these shows by a comedian in this case, but sometimes also by a performer or a singer, where if they don't really have a good full program yet, they do a tryout, right? And they can go and see how they are in the process of developing a bigger thing. And this is my modest way of saying to you that basically what you're seeing today is a tryout. It's a tryout of an idea, of a concept that we're in the process of studying, that I think is relevant to the topic of today. But that we don't really have data on yet, or at least not data that is clear enough, so in a way it's work in progress, but somehow I like the idea of tryout a little bit better. The key concept I would like also you to think about, or start thinking about, is the notion of what we call a psychological social contract. And I'll tell you about what it is, how we conceptualize that, and why that might matter to social change. But perhaps most importantly, is also if you think about social change and why it often doesn't happen, that a psychological social contract is also a way to keep societies together psychologically, especially in times when there's polarization, when there's intergroup conflict, and there's a lot of discussion about morally loaded issues also related to identity politics and so on. And this is why I would like to pitch this concept to you today from a social psychological perspective, basically asking the question, to what extent does that idea of a psychological social contract, that I will explain and define in a moment, will actually better help us to understand how we can promote social change, perhaps a greener environment, a more sustainable society, or whether it's actually part of what people have called friction, the resistance to social change, the thing you have to overcome in order to get things changed. Why? Because in society, of course, you think about polarization, intergroup conflict, a lot of public debate and a lot of public friction or conflict is enacted through collectives, to groups, to people who publicly protest. This is actually something that I've been studying for quite a while, so this is also the perspective that I come from. And in the literature, what you see is that we know quite a lot about how conflicts escalate, how polarization gets more toxic. And actually what we don't know a lot about is why that doesn't help us, why we don't really understand why that doesn't go further at some point. So why don't we see societies fall apart? Why don't we see people actually engaging in conflict that involves more violence and so on? So there must be some kind of a counter with it, some kind of dark matter, you could say, or white matter if you're an optimist, that makes protest also more, let's say, positive or constructive, even if people start to disrupt things. I will have two things to say about this. On the one hand, this notion of the psychological contract will explain, or we hope that it will explain, why society sticks together. At the same time, if you want change, perhaps exactly what you need to do is break the contract. Poke the bear. I'm not sure whether it's an English expression, but I'm sure it's right. Not because you want to destroy things, destructive, or but you want to disrupt things, and you might want to disrupt them in a constructive way. So in this case, for example, not actually harming anyone. Of course, this is a bad example. A lot of people are angry about this. You cannot harm art and that kind of stuff. This might also, if you think about effectiveness, for example, of collective action or effectiveness of social change, you can also wonder, okay, what would be a good route? Actually, just as a very bad self-promotion, but people told me put this in. Last year, a book came out, Social Protest, that basically is a lot about protest and about conflict, about escalation. And today I'll talk a bit more about de-escalation and about holding things together through the notion of the psychological contract. There's a link with a former colleague of mine, Groningen's idea about what he calls, in the context of change, organizational change, fuel and friction. A lot of people think that if you want to change things, for example, in an organizational context, you have to motivate people. What Lauren finds, or what Lauren Norton finds in his work, is that actually a better strategy often is to lower the friction. So the motivation is the fuel, but if the fuel is there, the engine will run. If you lower the friction, the resistance that will be there in the organization, or in society for that matter, you might actually have a better chance. This is comparable, I think, to, let's say, motivations and barriers to social change. Right? If you decrease barriers, then perhaps that's a better type of strategy. The way I think about it, before we go to the social contract, is that at the end of the day, if you want to understand these processes of change, you also have to take a little bit of a different view of people. Not necessarily as rational actors, individuals with all kinds of perceptions and so on, disconnected from the context to some extent. Not as people with strong identities, group identities, because there are many identities, so they can only do a couple of them. But particularly people who are connected in small networks, in bubbles, and then connected to identities kind of in the larger world. So basically, if you think about what people want at the end of the day, and what might also explain why people have a lot of friction against change, why people don't want change, it might not be just status quo bias or some kind of an internal process. It might be because people want to stay embedded, socially embedded. And they fear that if there's too much conflict in society, actually what happens is that you lose embeddedness, you lose community, you lose belonging. It's not so much an individual need as a very relational type of thing. From that perspective, if we are part of a society, whether we want this or not, people also need to be able to coordinate and cooperate with each other. Even if you have very different identities, very different values, and so on. So the idea is that there is some kind of a psychological social construct that is basically based on how I think about what you think, and whether there is similarity there. Similarity in shared identity, shared values, and perhaps most importantly, how, even if we disagree about identity and values, if we have polarization, how do we still coordinate our action in society so that the answer at the end of the day is not we need to split up. It's that type of contract at the level of the society that I'm talking about, and it's different from how philosophers would look at this. I'm just putting this slide on because, of course, I'm kind of borrowing a term with a lot of history. There's a reason for that, but this is why it's different. If you think about what the key difference is psychologically, it's this notion of intersubjectiveness. So you can think about social contracts as objective, right? What's in the constitution of your democracy? What is the rule of law? What are the things you get penalized for? But of course, we all know, especially as psychologists, that whatever is in the objective law is not necessarily reflective of the attitudes and the values that people have. You can also think about social contracts as subjectively real, but then every individual can have their own contract, their own idea about what all people should do and should feel and so on. That's also not really workable. So the perspective here taken is the idea that because people are relational beings, they are very good at thinking about and checking all the time what other people are thinking and whether they're still being lied. The typical philosophy example that they always give is driving on the right side of the road. Right? If everybody does that, you have coordination. And what happens is that you don't have to spend every 5 seconds wondering whether you are driving on the right side or whether other people are driving. The moment people start to drive on the left, there is a major panic, right? And a major disruption. That is exactly how I think the psychological social contract functions. As something that we don't see, as long as everything goes well. And the moment somebody violates it, you get major panic and fear of breakdown. So in a way, it's a very good stabilizer of social cohesion. And at the same time, the moment there is a violation of the contract, everybody will see. Still a bit like the taboo violation. How does that work? If it has this type of psychological form and function, which we think it has, then there is a structure to it, and the structure might be true across different societies, democratic societies. It's a sense of shared identity, a sense of shared values at the level of the democratic society, and shared principles of conflict regulation. Even if we differ in our identities, even if we differ in our values, then what are the rules that are fair to us that we can live together? So if somebody says, well, perhaps we don't need elections in the next term, it's probably one of these social contract violations based in the principle type of This is a proposition, and we're studying this at the moment. What's the form? What's the psychological fingerprint? And we're doing research in different projects in different countries, all democracies, but with very perhaps different meanings and constructions of democracy. And we also explore the social functions. So to what extent, if people feel there is a stronger contract in society, does that make them in a way more like a buffer against negative stuff, conflict stuff in society? Are they more tolerant in a way to other people having different views? And what we also can check is to what extent this is intersubjective, right? To the extent that it's their values, their perceptions, or whether they think this is what happens in the minds of others. There's actually quite some research in cultural psychology that shows that if you want to predict local behavior in a local environment, then what people think that other people think are the values, the intersubjective part, is actually more driving their behavior, just like with the driving on the right hand of the road example, than their own values. It's not that their own values don't matter, but that's the mechanism through which they coordinate and collaborate. Yeah. So, why is this a tryout? Because this is a concept that combines different concepts from the literature, at least in social psychology and beyond. And we're kind of in the first phase of empirically studying this. And I'll show you a slide with the program in a way that we have. But it's a little bit of a different program than what you would have if you would have like a big round and then everything is already set. Actually, what we have is different projects with their own questions, their own view, but they all revolve around the more central question of what is this notion of the psychological social contract? How can we study it? And that's basically also what we're trying out at. Empirical studies, of course, are needed in order to, perhaps in 1 or 2 years from now, we will have a different definition, or we'll have a different way of asking. Perhaps we have a different view on the functions, or perhaps it is as we think. So we can study the form, we can study the structure, and we do this in different democratic societies. And 2 options in terms of the function I think are important. One of them is to what extent is this notion of psychological contract that people perceive this a buffer against, let's say, escalation and conflict in society. Issues that split society, then actually you can try to reduce polarization, which we know is very difficult, but what you can also do is increase the contract, increase the strength of the contract. So it will be more like a positive psychology type of intervention. And the other is if you want to change the contract, for example, a more green one or a more equal one or whatever you want to call it. How do you do that? Well, the very premise that this is something that people want to be embedded in the society also means that they will be very motivated to protect it somehow if it's violent. It's uber moral in a way. It's more like a taboo violation that you don't want to see, but if it happens, you need to respond. And this is why we think that if you poke the bear as a movement, if you try to break the social contract for a moment, not to be destructive, but to be disruptive, then actually what you get is a negotiation process. How social change can actually change the content of the contract. This is related to research we've been doing with Eric Schumann in the US, in which we looked at movements who use constructive disruption strategies. These are strategies that disrupt but do not harm. That's basically the definition. So it's not violence, but it's very close to it, right? It's like disruptions of society, like trying to block roads, like for example Extinction Rebellion does every now and then. And they look at the effectiveness and the psychological process of what these types of actions do in the eyes of others, in terms of public opinion, public support. And what we find in, let's say, more artificial experiments, but also in the context of real-life Black Lives Matter protests, is that constructive disruption is actually a very helpful strategy, not in getting your sympathizers on board, but getting people who are somewhere in the middle, who are more resistant, or more in the friction part, to actually to make more concessions to the policies that you're doing. It's almost like a teenager who's breaking the rules just to get something else done, right? Perhaps some parents in the audience recognize this strategy. Like 16-year-old is doing this all the time. In the environmental context, for example, what you can see here, very nice work by Becker and his colleague, is that they studied 2019 Extinction Rebellion protests or riots, more radical type of action. And actually what they found is that despite, you could say, the anti-normative nature of the actions, the not so nice actions, environmental concern on average in public opinion went up. So if you think about effectiveness and about poking the bear, I would say the reason for that is that they are actually tapping into the violation of the social contract. People want to protect that, and as a consequence, even those who don't really agree, still come on board, or at least get more interested into the topic. How do we do this? And this is where I will stop. So we have a lot of different collaborators across the world. We're starting a little group called the Social Contract Club. Around 20 people right now, and we have 4 independent PhD students. I think Jerry, is still in the audience, Jerry Liao, he's working doing studies in Taiwan and in the Netherlands. We also have studies in South Africa, Germany, the USA, Australia, and Thomas, for example, is involved in this project as well, where we tried with different methods to kind of tap into this notion of the psychological social contract, to understand that better, to see whether the structure is similar across different countries, and to see whether the function is either to hold societies together, and more like a buffer, like a bandage to the wound, or whether you can also utilize it to poke the bear, or for movements to have a strategy to violate the social contract. And so long as you do this in a constructive way, I think that's actually quite an interesting way to think about how you can not only mobilize and motivate people, but also think about the friction element of the social contract. This is basically what I've said. A couple of flags to show it's international. One final illustration, just if you want to know more about what kind of context we use for social contract violations. In Germany, we present people with potential collaborations between the government and the AfD, for example, as a threat to the social contract. In the US, we've used the Capitol Hill incident as a clear violation of the social contract. And in Israel, before the war, there were mass anti-government protests, if you still remember, against every week mass demonstrations at Tel Aviv. And this was because they wanted to basically have anti-democratic change in their society. So just as an example of what type of studies we do as well. I think I'll leave it at that. So I think if you think about change and stability and notions of psychological social contract, and if you want to make it more green and sustainable, I'm not a climate change expert, but I can apply it to some extent. So either I think make use of the notion of psychological social contract, which is about what we all should share, or violate it in order to renegotiate it, to constructively disrupt society just a little bit, in order that even people who might disagree with you start thinking about the issue. Perhaps the effect is that this might actually be happening over time.